So we have that problem. That produced inflation, and we have the financial problem. So when you have debt, a lot of debt assets and a lot of debt liabilities, having that balancing act is not easy.
With a heavy heart, Ray Dalio declares that the ominous clouds of a total collapse have gathered on the horizon.
I look at three major forces that are happening now, haven't happened in our lifetimes, but have happened many times in history. And those three major forces are the creation of a lot of debt and the printing of a lot of money.
As default risks surge, the intricate dance of balancing debt becomes increasingly precarious, signifying an impending storm that could disrupt the financial landscape.
And there's a great deal of poverty and the breakup of the families and the guidance. There's a cycle that takes place. And so you're seeing the general competitive education levels, the conditions in Connecticut. So we have all of that debt, and now the government bonds have gone down. And it's funded by short-term debt, which the cost of money has gone up. Now, that's not just banks. That's not just the United States. That's a world phenomenon. It existed in Europe.
And that means that the default risk rises. However, because you're holding that, it means that the debt will be bad one way or another.
Holding debt in such tumultuous times becomes a high-stakes gamble, a gamble where the return of money is uncertain, raising questions about the stability of financial assets.
So we operate philanthropically, and I'll give you an example. And the kids have to get educated. And 60,000 kids didn't have computers or connectivity. And no government was going to do anything about it. So, we had to buy 60,000 computers to give it to kids in order for them to have education. Well, and there's hunger, and there's poverty, and imagine they created negative interest rates for money. So how does somebody make money holding a bond that has a negative interest rate? The way you do it is you have a more negative short-term interest rate that you borrow to fund it.
The delicate balancing act necessitated by debt becomes a global challenge, compelling central banks worldwide to resort to the drastic measure of printing money and acquiring debt to restore equilibrium.
If you're holding that debt, you are holding something that money will come back. Let's say the government can print the money, but if the money's hard, if that's going to be good money that's coming back, it's going to be hard for those entities to pay back because it's a lot relative to their income and cash flows to pay it.
There's a lot of particularly unproductive people. For example, for various reasons, but I live in the state of Connecticut, and my wife tries to help students in the poorest neighborhoods that have the worst conditions. And I'll give you this example. The state of Connecticut is usually number 1, 2, or 3 in the richest state in the country. But 22% out of the last survey, it's actually higher than this, 22% of the high school students in Connecticut have either dropped out of high school or have absentee rates of greater than 25% and in failing classes.
The perils intensify when a substantial amount of debt assets and liabilities coexists, especially when interest rates plummet well below the inflation rate, setting the stage for a potential financial crisis.
So when you have debt, a lot of debt assets and a lot of debt liabilities, having that balancing act is not easy. And so because we had the imbalance, the central banks of the world had to come in there and be buyers. They had to print money and buy that debt to make a balance at an acceptable interest rate. So we have that problem. That produced inflation. And we have the financial problem. Now that's connected also to what's happening in the world order, because the United States and China, most importantly, are approaching the greater risk of war. And also Russia is in that there have been supply lines. Supply chains have been broken and supply lines and so on. And that has worsened this set of circumstances for reasons having to do with geopolitical and so on.
We find ourselves in a critical juncture of the economic cycle, where the tightening of monetary policy, ostensibly to combat inflation, triggers fault lines that threaten the structural integrity of the financial system.
It's either bad because they don't pay it, it needs a haircut for them to pay it, or because they do pay it with money that is going to be printed to come back. So when you look at that, and that problem occurs when there's a lot of debt assets and a lot of debt liabilities. So think of it this way, just want to make this clear. When there was the position that interest rates got a lot below the inflation rate, you're losing buying power. There's no good reason to own that. And there's a change in psychology. In these cycles, there are short-term cycles that build up to create a long-term cycle. So, for example, we're used to what's commonly called the business cycle or the short-term debt cycle, in which there's a recession when economic weakness is economic weakness and low inflation, and then the central bank provides credit, and that stimulates activity, and then you have the pickup and the good time in the economy, but then it raises inflation and tightness and so on, and then they create tight money, and then you go through the contraction again and so on. So since 1945, there have been 12 and a half of those cycles. On average, they're about 7 years long, give or take about 3 years. So if you say, okay, where are we in that cycle? We're in the business cycle. We're about halfway through. We're in the part of the cycle where the tightening of monetary policy to fight inflation begins to cause the cracks. And that's where we are. Okay, now those add up to a big cycle, because debt rises relative to incomes through that, because everybody wants the higher up. And so they just keep doing that. And so we have a lot of debt assets and debt liabilities. We think of there's a debt that you owe, but one man's debt is another man's assets. And so you have to keep interest rates high enough that it compensates for inflation for holding it. Because if you don't, nobody's going to then want to lend and you have a problem. But you have to have interest rates not so high that they crack the economy.
Drawing parallels with history, Dalio invokes the aftermath of the Second World War, emphasizing how the victors shaped the economic order, a reminder that our current decisions will reverberate for generations.
The third force is the rising power, the challenging the existing power, largely in the form of China and to some extent Russia. Let's call it the great power conflict, because in 1945, there's this cycle. You have And after, you have winners, and the winners determine the rules of the game. And then there's this evolution of others becoming more competitive, and then you have a conflict again for who's in control. So we have that dynamic taking place. So those three influences, the financial, the internal conflict, external conflict influences are having a dominant influence. I learned before that when I was surprised, often it was because of things that hadn't happened in my lifetime before, but happened in history because of that reason. I went back and studied history, the last 500 years, on these cycles. There are big cycles that last about 75 years, give or take about 50 years, and of rises and declines. And I put that out because I think it's so important people understand it. I put it out in a book called The Changing World Order and in a free video called The Changing World Order. So when we look at each one of those, they're important. I also learned in studying history that there were two other influences that were very big, and you could see them. The first was acts of nature, such as droughts, floods, and pandemics. The changes over time in the evolution over time of people's learning and the technologies they make.
Unlike an imminent debt rollover, a colossal squeeze looms on the horizon, exerting immense pressure that could reshape the financial landscape in unforeseen ways.
While we don't have an immediate debt rollover like in the next year or two, we have a giant squeeze that's happening. And it's not only because of the debts, but even more important, the unfunded pension liabilities.
And that's when
and the healthcare costs. And so we have a squeeze that's emerging. We will, in 2 years, have the fiscal stimulation that we have pass, and we are going to be selling bonds, a lot more bonds to the rest of the world. We are a reserve currency. And because we're a reserve currency, we're in the very privileged position of having other countries want to save our currency and buy our bonds. But that is going to be risk.
In a poignant observation, Dalio reflects on a changing work ethic as people, influenced by societal shifts, contemplate whether the relentless pursuit of success remains an imperative in the face of evolving circumstances.
So I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is it's a rich town. And the public education gets about $24,000 per student. Last number I looked, it's probably higher than that now. Gets $24,000 a student. Up the road at Bridgeport, Connecticut, 10 minutes up the road, they get $14,000 a student because there's no tax base. And they need more money because, you know, the expenses of raising a kid are you also have to get them the computer, you've got to get them the food, the clothes, all of those things, and they have less food, less clothes, all those things. So, but in any case, what you can see is the education test scores and measures of how we're doing in education relative to other countries have declined. So part of it is education and circumstances. Part of it is, there are lots of parts of it. And then there's a certain element of it which, let's say because of or other reasons, that people have moved around and say, I don't have to work as hard anymore. So, just for example, the change in the attitudes of restaurant workers. Okay, I found another way to live and so on, and that's playing a role. Of course, also people, as the baby boomers are older, they drop out of it or they want to retire earlier, and they do.
Brace yourself for an economic revelation as Ray Dalio pierces the veil of uncertainty, exposing the impactful factors that loom on the horizon, poised to reshape economic stability.
Three things that are happening in our lifetimes that never happened in my lifetime or our lifetimes, and that I learned before I had to study past periods. And those three things, as you point out, are the creation of a lot of debt and money. The second is the amount of internal conflict that we're having over money and values and what that's like. And the third is the changing world order with countries like China and Russia competing with the United States in a way that didn't exist before. The truth is that if you divide the amount of money and credit that's used for spending by the quantity of goods produced, you can calculate, well, the prices will change. And so that's what's going on. And that's what went on in a giant wave, the Federal Reserve and the government together, a giant wave. And that produced a giant amount of inflation, a giant amount of inflation.
The narrative takes a dramatic turn as the looming specter of big inflation emerges, with Ray Dalio dissecting the origins of this economic force that threatens to reshape financial landscapes.
What you have to have, I think, most importantly, is a well-diversified portfolio of other assets. Diversification is a very powerful tool because it can reduce risks without reducing expected returns. Now, there's lots of ways of getting what you think good investments are. They might be things you know about and local businesses and so on, or they might be stocks, or they could be maybe a little gold or maybe a little bit foreign investing. Diversification is very important to do that in a balanced way. So I would generally say that that would be what I would recommend. Well, the best assets to not own, that's the most important thing, I think, is cash. And quoted, cash is trash. There will be a tightening here for the time being. And that tightening will have an effect. It'll hurt asset prices and so on. But cash is not the asset to hold. And bonds are not good to own, in my opinion, because it's debt. It's owning somebody's debt. Mm-hmm. And you won't get a return. Think of it, the interest rate will not reach the inflation rate.
Diversification becomes the protagonist in this financial drama, stepping onto the stage as the mighty guardian that can skillfully navigate and manage the risks inherent in investment.
Everybody agrees we need more money and we need more spending. But if you spend more than you earn, you have to borrow. Mm-hmm. And that creates debt. But that, at first, it's credit, so it gives you buying power.
Right.
But you have to pay it back, and that becomes depressing. And so, in order to avoid that, central banks can print money and buy it back, right? But when they do that, that depreciates the value of money. So what we had was a lot of money and credit go out to a lot of people, a lot of buying power. Everybody, when they got it, they thought, oh, that's great. And somehow they seemed surprised that when they spend it, the prices of everything go up. I look at three major forces that are happening now, haven't happened in our lifetimes, but have happened many times in history. And those three major forces are the creation of a lot of debt and the printing of a lot of money to buy that debt, particularly because the government is running large deficits, and so they don't have enough money, so the government has to print that money. So that creation of all of that debt and its financial implications and its economic implications is one force.
A seismic revelation shakes the foundations of conventional wisdom. Ray Dalio's bold assertion that holding assets as cash is akin to harboring trash, setting the stage for a radical reconsideration of investment strategies.
buying power is what matters, right? And so what happens is when inflation goes up faster than your other sources of income, you lose buying power.
Okay.
But what happens is somehow that seems more acceptable sometimes to people than if it was just taken out of your pocket. You see, if they, let's say, raise taxes or take it out of somebody's pocket, everybody complains, whoever's had the pocket taken out of. But if it comes through printing of money and everybody gets checks, it's more acceptable. But what happens is those who are holding money, like money market funds and bond funds, lose the buying power of that. So think about those bond funds. Those bond funds are like down about 10%, and inflation is up over, let's call it 8%. So they lost 18% of the buying power.
The plot thickens as the government grapples with substantial losses, forcing it to unleash a torrent of printed money, an action that sends shockwaves through the financial landscape, bearing profound implications.
We think of it as meaning higher prices, but to some extent that's a rich man's perspective, because they say, oh, now I have to pay more. But the reality is you don't get more stuff from that higher inflation. And so it bids it out of the hands of some people. And that hurts the people who are, who don't get it. Because It's really, so that's what's going on. You lose buying power. And so we're seeing a time now where you're going to lose buying power to inflation. And now you're going to see the Federal Reserve also tighten money and credit and raise interest rates. And when they do that, that creates less buying power, because when they say, okay, now you can't spend as much money and the prices are going high, but they do that in their crude way of trying to reduce inflation. But you get it from both ends, the higher prices and then the higher interest rates you have to pay, and the higher debt service costs, and also less availability of money. So it's a squeeze, like the squeeze that happened in the 1970s.
Against the backdrop of inflation's menacing advance, Ray Dalio unveils the perilous terrain where people's buying power hangs in the balance, painting a vivid picture of the potential consequences.
I also learned in studying history that there were two other influences that were very big, and you could see them. The first was acts of nature, such as droughts, floods, and pandemics. The changes over time in the evolution over time of people's learning and the technologies they make. So I'd say there are the really 5 big influences that drive everything, and they are the money and debt, economic influence, the internal conflict, the external conflict, the nature influence, and the, let's call it the technology influence. So as we go now into this, it's important.
Enter the stage of economic growth influencers, where the plot unfolds with a series of revelations about the forces that could shape or stunt the growth trajectory of nations.
One man's debts are another man's assets. Okay, so what happened? The government had to sell a lot of debt. And when it sold a lot of debt, there were a lot of entities that bought a lot of bonds, government bonds. And money was very easy, which meant that short-term interest rates were very low. And money was actually being given away, because they had interest-only loans and interest rates were less than 1%, and you didn't have to pay back principal, so you could go get money. And so that created a lot of debt, and it created a lot of buying of government bonds.
The tension escalates as the government's strategy of selling substantial debt takes center stage, a move that sends ripples through the economic fabric, carrying implications for both nations and individuals.
These things go in paradigm shifts that quite often take a relatively long time, because everybody's mindset is in a paradigm shift. Everybody's mindset is in a certain place, and they're doing certain things. For example, investors think that cash is safe, and they don't pay much attention to inflation. And then what happens is they get inflation, and they realize that if I'm holding cash, I'm losing buying power. Mm-hmm. So then they shift. They sell out their cash, or they sell out their bonds, and they put that into other things. And when they do that, that also contributes to inflation.
In a dramatic twist, the call to awareness echoes through Ray Dalio's words, urging use to confront the looming specter of inflation that, like an unseen force, has silently entered the economic narrative.
The second force is the internal conflict, the amount of conflict that's internally, largely due to the largest wealth gaps that we've had since the 30s. And that produces populism of the left and the right, particularly when there are financial difficulties. The third force is the rising power, the challenging the existing power, largely in the form of China and to some extent Russia. So let's call it the great power conflict, because in 1945, there's this cycle. You have and after you have winners, and the winners determine the rules of the game. And then there's this evolution of others becoming more competitive, and then you have a conflict again for who's in control. So we have that dynamic taking place. So those three influences, the financial, the internal conflict, external conflict influences are having a dominant influence.
The narrative crescendos with a resounding acknowledgement of the economic reality we face, guided by Ray Dalio's insights, offering a glimpse into the turbulence and challenges that lie ahead.
Changes like that also happen in a lot of ways, like cost of living increases in compensation. Where in the past, when they don't worry about inflation, then they don't think about, do I have an inflation-linked contract for my work? Or do I have enough inflation assets? It might be, do I need to buy, I'm going to store my money in a house, or I might store my thing. And so that pendulum swing from one mindset and one positioning to another mindset and another positioning in the early stages tends to be self-reinforcing. Those actions produce more inflation and more inflation psychology until that goes to the opposite extreme. Like in the 1970s, people were surprised about what happened because they weren't used to inflation much. Then you had the inflation, and in the beginning, it swung, and then at the end of it, they said inflation will never end, and everybody's positioned for it never ending. And then, of course, what happens is it's so bad that then the central bank goes the opposite extreme, and then they get surprised. And so the 80s was a period which was the exact opposite of the 70s, where you have falling inflation, high real interest rates, and so on. And so the worst assets to own in the 70s were bonds, and the best assets to own in the 80s were bonds. So you see these pendulum swings that way.